Anyway, I'm honored to be here at Texas A&M University. I am a retiree of the Texas A&M University system. I worked at Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon, Texas as the curator of art and Western heritage for 31 years before I moved to the National Cowboy Museum in 2018. During that time while I was in Canyon, I did a handful of Texas art exhibitions and wrote a few articles, a few exhibition catalogs and so on. But one of my projects I always wanted to accomplish is accomplished here this evening with this exhibition, The Cowboy in Texas Art. I gave a presentation at Heritage Auction Galleries in Dallas about 10 years ago, and it posed the question, why are there no cowboys in early Texas art? It was my experience that early Texas art collections were really rather myopic, in my opinion, about what should constitute early Texas art subjects. And so that's basically the gist of tonight's presentation, is how we got here, what hurdles were overcome to put this outstanding exhibition on the wall. There are great art objects in the other room. The installation crew here is to be applauded for the work that they did. It's really a really fine thing. And to see something that you've dreamed about doing for a very long time come to fruition is really, it's very compelling in many, many different ways. I find that these are more effective if instead of me talking at you for the next 45 or 50 minutes, let's have a conversation. So if I say something that's unclear, feel free to interrupt me. I'm used to that. That's okay. I do a lot of public programming. I'm a public historian. And in fact, I have to apologize for my grizzled appearance because this coming weekend is the 32nd annual Chuck Wagon Festival at the National Cowboy Museum, and I do a living history program, and I'm partly in character right now with my facial hair. So the walrus mustache is actually real. It's not actually applied. My wife was mortified that I came down here without trimming up, so you'll have to bear with me. I hope the slides will project better than my lead slide, so we'll see. So one of the things that always baffled me is the embrace of the cowboy in Texas popular culture on some levels. And of course, Fort Worth Stockyards today is literally printing money because they can't do enough about the cowboy there. A lot of this is due to a great deal of interest in the American cowboy these days. And that extends internationally, and this is something that we need to acknowledge. There's no greater symbol, as an historian of the American cowboy, there's no greater symbol, more recognizable symbol worldwide than the cowboy, bar none. And I'll just tell you a quick aside. I was blessed to curate an exhibition on cowboys for a history museum in Szeged, Hungary. They opened to 7,000 people last June on opening night. 7,000 people. That's how much everyone wants to be a cowboy. So in Fort Worth, and all across the state of Texas, so let this symbolize that the embrace of the cowboy is alive and well, but not necessarily in early Texas art circles. There are some public monuments like this Robert Summers monument in downtown Dallas. So just going to hit a few high points just to let us know. Of course, our sports teams, many of them, of course, use a cowboy motif or our ranching heritage as a particular symbol. And of course, the Dallas Cowboys is the best known of that in particular. Of course, we have Big Tex at the State Fair of Texas. We also use the giant cowboys to sell liquor, as well as steaks near my old hometown up near Amarillo at the Big Texan. And even in my hometown of Canyon, Texas, Tex Randall greeted people on Highway 60 coming from Hereford at a curio shop back in the 60s. He still stands there fully restored of late. However, when Texas celebrated its sesquicentennial in terms of the art that was produced in this state, we did great exhibitions like the Houston School, really an outstanding exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. Yet there was nary a Stetson hat to be found in any of these works of art. Likewise, the Whitty Museum in San Antonio, their contribution was an outstanding exhibition on Julian Onderdonk, obviously one of our giants in early Texas art, and I got to see a pretty spectacular example on this campus this afternoon, thanks to Kathy and Bill and Linda. But nary a booted spur anywhere to be found in this exhibition. And likewise, in fact, one of the exhibitions that got some of the most attention nationally was Lone Star Regionalism at the Dallas Museum of Art, and it's largely these three exhibitions that are responsible for the fervor for early Texas art that happened post mid-1980s and certainly after 1986. However, ranching and farming in Texas really was only seen as an avenue for social criticism about farming and ranching harmful practices, such as drought-stricken area here by Alexander Hogue, and even in other ranching paintings like Texas Synthesis by Kathleen Blackshear on the left, and On the Ranch by Jerry Bywater. So it was acceptable to vilify the cowboy in early Texas art, and that was embraced in certain respects. So this is the early Texas art playbook. If it had a San Antonio mission, a West Texas landscape, something about the Gulf Coast, and certainly Texas wildflowers, we were all about that as far as collecting that. There was frothing at the mouth over these kinds of depictions. However, believe it or not, here at Texas A&M College, what it was called then, during this time actually recognized, perhaps because of its original charter, that agriculture actually provided legitimate subjects for artists to paint. And so this painting here is in the gallery next door called Sorrel Bronc by an artist from Clarendon, Texas, who actually attended Texas A&M College briefly but did not matriculate here due to a family illness. He was called back home to Clarendon. This painting was amongst a group of paintings of Texas artists that were featured here on this campus in 1929 in the spring. And Sorrel Bronc that you see on the screen right now was the favorite amongst the students here. So at least in some circles, there was appreciation for the cowboy in early Texas art. A few months later, the third version of the San Antonio competitive exhibitions, the first started out with a recognition of Texas wildflowers as a legitimate subject for artists to paint, with pretty profound prize monies of $5,000 for a non-Texan and $1,000 for a Texan, which I've always sort of baffled me. I won't go into that. I would see Bill and Linda Reeves' great book on the San Antonio competitive exhibitions. But some of the prize winners were not from the state, like this particular painting that's in the other room. However, even though this is ostensibly to depict West Texas cowboys, and he does get some details right, even though he was a Californian, such as the khaki clothes. All khaki clothes became something of a uniform amongst West Texas cowboys. So there is some legitimacy, but I think the point to be made here is the Texas artists who painted cowboys were not recognized in the third San Antonio competitive, which had a whole separate category for ranch life. Another Californian, of course, was Frank Tenney Johnson, who was well respected as a Western painter. I think we missed one. No, we didn't. And a Taos artist, W. Herbert Dunton, who in many respects was something of an adopted Texan because he toured Texas throughout the mid and late 1920s with his depictions of Texas cow hands and trail drives and so on. And Old Texas, which is one of his masterpieces, hangs in the other room. It also received an honorable mention at San Antonio, but no Texas artists were recognized for their work depicting Texas cowboys. A few years later, in 1936, at the Texas Centennial, when there had been a competition amongst all the major Texas cities to be the host site for the Central Exposition, and Dallas won out. You know, Dallas, of course, has a long history as a cow town. Just saying. In any case, so the cowboy was fully embraced by all of the promoters of the Texas Centennial, and obviously the cowboy motif was front and center in everything they did, as you can see from these posters. At Houston, the Houston Centennial, slightly smaller, it celebrated the Texas history in particular, but also featured the Hogg Brothers collection of Frederick Remington paintings as its contribution to the Centennial, but no Texas artists, of course. And in Fort Worth went all Western all day long, partly with Amon Carter's response to not receiving the bid to do the Central Exposition. So in Fort Worth, it was the Fort Worth Frontier Centennial Exposition, and it eventually had Western artists, including depictions of cowboys by W. Herbert Dunton, as you see here, and then 6 Texas artists were represented in that exhibition, including H.D. Bugbee, as you can see. Eisenlohr didn't really paint that many cowboys. Tex Moore certainly did, and then a man, relatively small reputation man named Frank Ray, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So back to the Dallas Centennial Central Exposition in 1936, of course, that embrace was full, and virtually all the promotional materials, as you can see here, even Father Texas welcoming the world to Dallas and ostensibly welcoming the world to Texas, and of course, who should be the ambassador, but of course, a cowboy. Even Gene Autry came and made a film here called The Big Show at the Centennial Exposition in Dallas, and showed on the Esplanade a whole bevy, a whole platoon, a whole company of cowboys riding down that central Esplanade there in Dallas. And as you can see, even made it into the soft drink industry with those Texas cowboys surrounding that ice-cold cooler of Coca-Cola and wearing a Centennial souvenir cowboy hat, of which there's an example there. So look at there, celebrating cowboys during the Texas Centennial in 1936, and even in some of the murals that were painted in the Hall of State, for example, and particularly in the West Texas room. If you visit this today, hopefully it's open again, but you'll notice that the rope and cowhides were embedded into the wall. This is all cowhide down here. And then, of course, the rope motif is in the coffered ceilings. Horsetails hang off the shades, and, of course, off the window shades, and then ranch brands, kind of hard to see in this photograph. But the real heroes are this great Tom Lee mural at the other end of a West Texas cowboy, and Dorothy Austin's incredible sculpture of in life in pine that stands right in front of that cowhide-clad wall, along with the rope motifs, as well as San Antonio ceramics celebrating, don't look, but it's a cowboy on a bucking horse. So in the West Texas room, that was certainly acceptable. And even in the North Texas room, here's Father Texas again, embracing modernity, of course, acknowledging Texas's cattle raising past and building the country. But don't you bring none of those cowboys in the Hall of Fine Arts here at the brand new Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, which was air conditioned. No, you could find Italian shepherds, Russian princesses, depictions of Chauvigny, France, but you're not about to find a cowboy anywhere in these halls in this brand new art museum, certainly not painted by a Texas artist. There was a small exhibition on Frederick Remington, but of course he's an outsider. And if we're going to talk about real Texas art, we're going to talk about Texas subjects like Russian princesses and French landscapes and so on. You could even find Oklahoma rocks in the Texas section in the new Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, but you're not about to find a cowboy. The Texas Centennial Exposition was repackaged a year later as the Greater Texas and Pan American Exposition, and lo and behold, there's that ranching motif with a beautiful Mexican señorita, sort of a nod to perhaps Texas's Mexican past, but again, it's a nod to ranching. Believe it or not, in the Greater Texas and Pan American, two paintings of cowboys made their way in, Maxine Perini from Abilene and Fred Darge from Dallas. That was it in terms of the hundreds of paintings and sculpture at this repackaging of the Centennial Exposition. So what the heck was going on? What was the antipathy towards cowboys as subject in fine arts in Texas? It's a real baffling thing. Was it because we had no history in ranching here in Texas, other than the fact that after the landing of Spanish explorers on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, bringing cattle and horses by 1521 and establishing the ranching industry in the Americas in 1521, and the beginnings of the cowboy tradition on that Gulf Coast of Mexico with Mexican vaqueros. More than likely, the very first cowboys very first vaqueros were probably enslaved Native Americans, or more likely enslaved black men. That tradition made its way up into Texas by 1720. So Texas was very much at the foundation of the whole cowboy mythology. And we can see it in this particular painting by Thomas Allen. These are all vaqueros here, every one of them. And this is a rodeo going on in the back, what we call a roundup, because of course rodear means to encircle in Spanish. And in many parts of the American Southwest through the greater part of the 20th century, a roundup was called a rodeo. And I don't mean NASCAR on hooves like you see at the National Finals Rodeo in Las Vegas. That's a whole different thing. So these are the very first cowboys in Texas, our Mexican vaqueros. Come on, there we go. Robert Onderdonk, of course, depicted what you would expect of Texas cowhands here, but also Mexican vaqueros in this scene of San Antonio Plaza. And of course, Theodore Gentile depicted the watermelon race, of course, cowboy sport in this case with some vaqueros racing with a watermelon. So certainly through the latter part of the 19th century, there was precedent in and around San Antonio in particular, but it's this artist, Frank Ray, who was, in fact, the only artist who painted the great Texas cattle drives while they were happening. From 1866 to 1897, cattle were driven out of South Texas and northern Mexico through different parts of Texas, first East Texas on the Shawnee Trail, then up the Chisholm Trail system through central Texas, and then the Western Trail that crossed the Red River at Vernon on up to around Dodge City and continuing on all the way up into Western Canada to establish ranches the whole way. And only Frank Ray was there to depict these events while they were happening. His first depictions of cowboys are in 1883 when he travels to Young in Palo Pinto County and paints what he called cowboys in Western Texas in this particular pastel. Later on, by the late 1880s, he's depicting a herd of cattle at a stock tanks. Here's the cowboy right here on the man-made dam. A painting he sketched in 1887 near Henrietta and then came back and finished after studying in Paris. Probably his masterpiece in depicting this entire industry was O Roundup, Texas, 1888, which he finally completed in 1894. Again, this was the largest roundup he'd ever seen, 15,000 head of cattle, several thousand horses, and he never did indicate how many chuck wagons because oftentimes these giant roundups in West Texas involved multiple ranches and multiple crews. And if you'll notice in the landscape, there are no trees. And this is something that we fail to grasp today, is from southern Texas, southwestern Texas in particular, all the way to Canada, there were virtually no trees, people. Virtually no trees. And of course, today mesquites have overtaken a great deal of that. There are some parts of the western United States and the Great Plains where you can still see that, but for the most part, mesquites and cedars have taken over most of that rangeland. So it's really quite a document to that industry. He was also photographing cowboys in Texas far earlier than most everybody understood. Mr. Ray's work as a frontier photographer has never been explored by way of exhibition or publication. At Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, we had about 400 prints and glass plate negatives. There are a couple of hundred at the University of Texas, at the HRC, and a few others scattered around in different places. This is actually a print made from one of those glass plate negatives. I like it because the emulsion went a little weird, and it makes for a heck of a moody image. But he also took photographs of cowboys working, and in this case, cutting out two. He would make sketches in the field of cowboys or cowboys watering cattle on the Brazos or any branch of the West Texas rivers, whether that be the Little Wichita, the Pease, different forks of the Brazos, even on the Red and on the Canadian throughout his career. He was showing his depictions of Texas cowboys at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, a World's Fair in St. Louis by 1904, with In the Rain, as you see here, now owned by the University of Texas, and exhibited it at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. So he is showing these depictions of Texas cowboys by a Texas artist at national exhibitions, national invitationals. When he showed at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in 1904, the cowboy was on full display with monumental sculptures by Solon Borglum, the brother of the better-known Gutzon Borglum, who designed and sculpted Mount Rushmore. Resting Cowboy was one of several, 4 or 5, I believe, by Borglum at the Midway. And of course, Remington's sculpture today called Cowboys Coming Through the Rye was, as you can see, 4 times life size in plaster staff on that Midway. So Mr. Ray is right there with that national reveal about cowboys. And of course, even later in his career, when most of West Texas had been fenced with distant herd going, this is actually another version of his great series called 24 Hours with the Herd, which was a performance piece to give us a better idea of what a trail drive was really like. Most of these sketches for 24 Hours with the Herd are at UT, and the entire 7-painting series is at UT, but I'm sorry to say their poor condition eventually led to their virtual entire repainting by his student Revo Bassett. So the remnants of Mr. Ray with 24 Hours with the Herd is largely gone. So we really don't see his mastery in this particular series. A contemporary of Ray, but a much later comer to depicting cowboys in West Texas, was Harvey Wallace Kaler, who cowboyed in Kansas and various other places and eventually settled at Big Spring. We do have, of course, this great rush for water, always a challenge for a thirsty herd when they had been without water for hundreds of miles. Just a couple of other examples. Big Spring is very protective of the legacy of Harvey Kaler, and so the fact that Mr. Now has one of his best paintings in his collection and also in the current exhibition is a real tribute to perseverance, because Big Spring will not turn loose of their favorite son. Here's a couple of others. One in a private collection in Big Spring, another private collection Big Spring. Here we go. And this one at the Heritage Museum in Big Spring, a painting that I actually got to see in person when we conserved it at Panhandle Plains. And then this one actually hangs at the Kansas City Stockyards, commissioned in 1900 when Kansas City was the largest cattle receiving point in the world, and Amarillo, Texas was the largest cattle shipping point in the world, which a lot of people don't realize. And then, of course, this painting in the Reynolds Cattle Company in Fort Worth, and this one which hangs Old Texas in the old Trail Drivers of Texas room at what's now part of the Whitty Museum in San Antonio. We would be remiss if we didn't remember the cowboy photographer Irwin E. Smith, about whom our good friend Byron Price has written an excellent study volume, and I'm told that recently in meetings with the Amon Carter Museum, who owns this collection, Mr. Price will do a revised edition of this very, very important book. Most of us believed for the very longest time that these were documentary photographs, when in fact almost all of them are staged by Irwin Smith and his friends, and he often appears in his own photographs. Fairly recent discovery as a Texas artist with his chops as a cowboy painter was Fred Darge, who was a German immigrant. When Friedrich Darge got here and eventually got to Texas by the early 1930s, worked as a cowhand primarily in West Texas in the Big Bend region. Had a really wonderful exhibition at the Museum of the Big Bend in the last couple of years. That was a self-portrait, by the way. This painting is in the other room. He really had a great body of work depicting the West Texas ranchings and cowboys he'd seen himself. This is also in the other room. Great painting from the Now collection. This may be one of his masterpieces, if not his masterpiece, which I believe was largely inspired by his travels to Taos, New Mexico, where he would have seen the work of W. Herbert Dunton, with whom he was a friend. And I believe that the frieze-like approach to this particular painting may have in fact been borrowed from Andy Adams' 1903 publication called The Log of the Cowboy, and you'll see this up here. This frieze-like approach to a cattle drive very much echoed in what Darge was doing. But probably the greatest cowboy artist in Texas, I'll say this without reservation, was really H.D. Bugbee, who for all intents and purposes was the Charlie Russell of Texas. When he began working in Texas by 1913, there were virtually no cowboy artists who were doing this kind of work. Mr. Kaler was already deceased. Mr. Ray always said, I was not a cowboy artist. I depicted longhorn cattle and the landscape of West Texas, and occasionally a cowboy might find its way into my work. But really it was H.D. Bugbee who made cowboys in Texas the focus of his life's work. Plus he was a working cowboy himself on the family 3B ranch northwest of Clarendon. This is the earliest known oil of one of his cowboy pictures. He's 17 years old when he exhibited this in his first professional exhibition. All of these are in the Panhandle Plains Historical Society Museum. Panhandle Plains Historical Society owns the collections there The building is owned and maintained by the state of Texas, so it's important to remember that distinction. Mr. Bugbee, by the early 1920s, was doing really highly accomplished paintings like J.A. Horse Wrangler, probably a self-portrait because, like his idol Charlie Russell, he worked as a day worker and also as a horse wrangler throughout his career. But his major break actually came when he received a major commission to paint, I believe it's 14 paintings for the Amarillo Hotel, which at that time was the Cattleman's Hotel. And these are 6 of the paintings that I've been able to track down of those 14. And I believe J.A. Horse Wrangler may have been another. But you can see by it's really kind of hard to see. Mr. Now owns this, private collection. This is at Panhandle Plains. This is a recent gift to the National Cowboy Museum. I'll skip that one. And this is in a private collection in Dallas. This one lives in a box at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas, where it's lived since 1948, in a box in pieces. That's all I'm going to say about that. Mr. Bugbee received a break when he took a trainload of J.A. steers to Kansas City in 1923 and secured Findlay Art Galleries as his representative. This is 1923. He's just 23 years old. And eventually he secured art galleries in Kansas City, Denver, Chicago, New York, including Farrar-Gale Galleries on Fifth Avenue in New York, which by this time was handling John Stewart Curry, Thomas Hart Benton, and the leading American painters of the time. That's pretty big stuff for a cowboy painter from Texas who couldn't get recognized in his own state. He would go on to paint great paintings on the JA, the RO, and many area ranches in West Texas, where he often traded his roping skills for an opportunity to sketch. And you can see in Rope Corral, which is the large painting here, he would make working studies of different parts or working sketches of the entire composition to help him, following the academic method, to literally build a 30 by 40 canvas that you see here. I actually found this in the basement of the Bugbee Ranch House, standing in a puddle of water, and eventually we got it out of there and got it restored, put a new frame on it. This is actually a self-portrait showing Mr. Bugbee roping a steer, and behind him is J. Evetts Haley on the black horse. Mr. Haley and Mr. Bugbee collaborated on numerous books of Western history with Mr. Bugbee as the illustrator in pen and ink. Oh, I got a little ahead of myself. Here he is with one of his sketches he took to New York City to secure a gallery to represent himself, as well as looking for illustration work in ranch romances in many of the pulp Western magazines of the time, and that's Farrar-Gale's on Fifth Avenue that I mentioned before. So by 1933, he had galleries all across the United States, but not in Texas. This is an example of one of his pen and inks that he did for Willie Newberry Lewis's Between Sun and Sod, The History of Donnelly County. This is an African-American bronc rider named Billy Freeman. Black cowboys, of course, had made their way from East Texas along the Gulf Coast out to West Texas. Billy Freeman, Gus Lee, and of course the best known is Matthew Bones Hooks, recently inducted into the Hall of Great Westerners at the National Cowboy Hall of Fame. Mr. Bugbee also took his work on the road to public art. These are 3 of the murals that grace the east wall of the Pioneer Hall at Panhandle Plains Historical Society Museum in Canyon. How many of y'all have ever been there? All right, kids, you got to get out more. We can do better. Anyway, this is a Public Works of Art project mural here. This is a WPA mural here. This is finished by 1940, this one by 1934. This one painted in 1956. He did 2 more murals for that hall. He exhibited in the Texas Centennial, but only at the University Centennial Art Exposition at the University of Texas. His work was rejected for the Central Exposition in Dallas. He vied for the Amarillo Post Office mural competition in 1939. This is one of his sketches. Eventually, Julius Woltz, whose great cowboy images you'll see in the other room, secured that commission, and it's one of the finest mural cycles you'll see in the entire state. Here you go, Julius Woltz, there you go. That's another story for another lecture, but let's say that guy deserves a medal for all the cowpunchers that went in and watched him paint those on a scaffold to the point where he had to leave town for a while because he couldn't stand up under all their criticism constantly. Mr. Bugbee eventually painted a series of murals for the old Tascosa nightclub in the basement of the Herring Hotel, opened in 1926. Oh, come on, there we go. These are black and white photographs of those murals that were all painted over, every one of them. And I thought they'd been washed off the wall because they used to give tours of the Herring Hotel. Only the hitching rail, this one here, still exists. The rest of them peeled off and fell on the floor. So painted over murals can be rescued if they're given proper attention. By the late 1930s, he's painting paintings like this, which is really an excellent example of his work as a regionalist. A companion in Amarillo was Ben Carlton Meade, who never worked as a cowhand, primarily as an illustrator for books by J. Frank Dobie, as you can see here and on the open range. And LX Horse Corral, and I have to pause here to tell a story about this painting. When I saw it for the first time, it looked like it had been dipped in molasses, and it was all nicotine. Nicotine around a heavy smoker will stick to works of art until it starts to look like syrup. And it literally will start running down the face of a painting. And it was sold at an Amarillo garage sale for a dime. And I tracked it for 20 years until I finally convinced the then owner to donate it to Panhandle Plains. We had it cleaned, we had it restored because it had a tiny tear on the back, repaired with a Band-Aid. I'm not making this up. Repaired with a Band-Aid. And it was actually one of the paintings that appeared along with a series of paintings he did on the LX Ranch, which is northwest of Amarillo, including the Fat Stock Show that Amarillo used to hold in the late 1930s and early 1940s. This is actually a still life of cowboys that I found when I did a Ben Carlton Meade show way back in 2003. And the props were given by none other than George Saunders, who was the founder of the Old Trail Drivers of Texas. Another artist not included in our exhibition today was a Fort Worth artist, Wallace Simpson, whose work is extremely rare. He was a working cowboy, worked at the Fort Worth stockyards as a cattle commission agent, and eventually secured his own star on the Walk of Fame in the Fort Worth stockyards as a cowboy artist. Revo Bassett, one example of this tripartite composition. This one is in the other room. Panhandle Plains owns the pastel version, which is the field sketch. And then, of course, Country Store had an example. I believe it was about 3.5 feet tall, 6 feet wide. I do not know where it is today. But we do have this excellent example of Revo Bassett's work, probably sketched on a sketching trip with Frank Ray. Mary Bonner, of course, was exhibiting her etchings called Les Cowboys in Paris in the mid-1920s to great acclaim. And of course, much of hers was in response to rodeo, not so much cow and horse work, but also in particular Wild West shows. And this is more than likely not a male rider. This is probably a female rider, in my opinion, because cowgirls were a big part of Wild West shows and early rodeo, an important distinction. Here we go again. And of course, she uses that frieze-like approach that we've seen before. She's winning prizes in Paris, France, and yet comes back to San Antonio to some acclaim, but it was largely localized. Even Jerry Bywaters, the great towering presence for Texas regionalism, would on occasion venture into the cowboy country with this depiction of a cowboy testing his stirrups at Fairplay, Colorado, and also a mural of John Chisholm at the Paris, Texas Public Library, and even in his lithography here, Election Day at Balmorhea, and then a wood block or a lino cut here, and also another lithograph. So he would actually depict cowboys from time to time, but it was a small part of his work. Russell Vernon Hunter, who was the assistant director at the Dallas Museum of Art with Jerry Bywaters in 1943, really made most of his Texas paintings while he lived at Farwell, Texas, and back and forth between Farwell and Texaco, New Mexico, right on the Texas-New Mexico line. And his masterpiece, and I challenge anyone to find a better regionalist painting of a cowboy than Cowman, which is one of my favorite paintings the whole time I worked up there in Canyon. And I was telling Bill early on, we didn't know its date until we finally got it cleaned, and it was about 10 years earlier than we thought, so it's 1928. He did do some watercolors and some other depictions of cowboys while he's there, but he really focused on ranch life in far west Texas, as did Otis Dozier, another Dallas regionalist, in his Fredericksburg, Texas loading cattle on the rail cars in 1939. This is actually a sketch for a mural for the Giddings, Texas Post Office at the Jerry Bywater's collection at SMU. He also focused on rodeo as well as cow work in both his lithographs as well as his later paintings, as you can see here and in examples in the other room. Lloyd Goff also participated in the New Deal mural program. This is a sketch for his Cooper, Texas mural here, and this is a figure study that Panhandle Plains owns to help him prep for that particular mural. James Buchanan Buck Wynn should very much be part of this conversation, especially with his large-scale mural series he did for the city of Wimberley in 1950, and of course lived in Wimberley for most of his life, but he was an original member of the Dallas Nine, often forgotten as part of that. So even the printmakers in Texas were depicting cowboys, male and female. And I put this up not as Lone Star printmakers as the group, but printmakers in the Lone Star State, both male and female, including Florence McClung, as you can see here, Bertha Landers here, Samuel Ziegler, and of course, Caprock Ranch by Alexander Hogue. New Deal played a huge role in exposing the country that really embraced cowboys as subject all across the American West. I'm a mural visitor at post offices, and I'll pull off the road, much to my poor wife's chagrin, to see yet another post office mural. And this actually hangs at the Hutchinson County Museum in Borger, this one here, taken off the wall of their post office, and another proposed mural here. But the greatest probably of all is the Tom Lee mural at Odessa. If you've never seen this masterpiece, this is on in the top 100 of world art, believe it or not, and it's as long as this wall. First time I saw it, it was in the new post office and not well protected. Let's just say it had not been well cared for, and it's now at the Odessa Art Center, where it's well protected and well treasured. And of course, Tom Lee, from his position in El Paso and for a time in Santa Fe, painted cowboys in all their different guises, as well as a commission from Life magazine to talk about the beef industry from its foundings on the Gulf Coast of Mexico in 1521 all the way up to present day. I believe that this series was recently featured or will be featured soon at the Dallas Museum of Art. I know that Sue Canterbury and I have been fighting over who gets to make the request first, because these paintings live in the vault all the time at the Dallas Museum of Art. Probably one of my favorite paintings in the current exhibition is this painting by Lois Neville Kelly. I go to great lengths in discussing it in the catalog, particularly what this represents, because this man is Hispanic. This is a vaquero, but this is a vaquero as a cowboy by the 1930s. And his sombrero, his baqueteada, has evolved to a sombrero tejana, a Texas hat, as you can see. He's wearing the white shirt and Levi's, no Wranglers here, folks. Wranglers are rodeo jeans, they're not cowwork jeans. So if you have any of those and you want to be authentic, take them out in the backyard and burn them in the grill and go buy a pair of Levi's. So blue jeans that were Levi's, possibly some waist overalls made by Lee Jeans, and a white shirt were a uniform for those West Texas cowboys. He's wearing West Texas style chaparreras, or as we call them today, chaps or chaps, depending on where you're standing. His boots are pretty typical. Of course, there are no cowboy boots in the world until the 1870s, because those very first vaqueros were riding barefoot. And his espuelas are eventually evolved into effective tools for cow work. And my good friend Noe Perez just pointed out the fact that here's a man that spends his entire life in the sun, and yet Lois Kelly poses him in the shade. That's pretty effective and a really harsh statement. So go examine this painting in the other room. Maurice Burnson was a Canadian painter and had the opportunity to paint this mural, and you can see it here in a black and white photograph in the Killarney Cafe in downtown Canadian, and there's not much of a downtown in Canadian, by the way. We were able to rescue from his studio the working sketches for those murals that wrapped all the way around the room and then eventually were painted over. And it was all about Canadian as a ranch country. It was the first rodeo town in Texas, by the way. It was holding rodeos before Pecos was. They don't tell Pecos that because it makes them mad. But nevertheless, Harry Anthony DeYoung, an example of which in the other room, a San Antonio artist who painted a great deal in the Davis Mountains country, but also couldn't help but depict Texas cowboys. Anybody recognize that name? He's the bluebonnet guy, ain't he? What in the world are their cowboys doing in a good Salinas painting? That's because he was familiar with this and knew that Old West scenes, and particularly paintings of cowboys, had a particular audience here in Texas, and this is one of the best I've ever seen. This requires a great deal of study, especially the prickly pear in the foreground, which became something of a signature for him. But this vaquero or cowboy coming up and pushing. Now these are probably 4 and 5 year old steers. These wouldn't be beef cattle. These have gotten too big to push up the trail. And so there's something of a statement here in terms of ranching history. Harry Worthman, I threw this in for Little Bill because Harry Worthman, also not terribly well known as a Texas artist, but also painted cowboys in West Texas, as you can see. And in 1965, a group of artists in Arizona got together and founded the Cowboy Artists of America. The following year, they had their first exhibition at the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, where I work today. And they held that exhibition, those exact exhibitions there for about 12 years. James Boren, one of the founding members of the Cowboy Artists of America, became the first art director at the National Cowboy Museum. He was a native Texan and eventually moved back down to Texas, where he finished out his career as a proud member of the CAs. This is an excellent example from his body of work. Now, I'm blessed that some contemporary Texas artists who focus on cowboys, and in this case, cowgirls, I've had the privilege of knowing. Donna Howell-Sickles does most of all of her work from her excellent studio at St. Joe, Texas, a good place to visit in the North Texas Hill Country on Highway 82 going east and west. It's quite something, where they have an annual cowboy symposium called the Real West, usually in the spring. Donna's decided, although she grew up on a stock farm at Seivel's Bend, not far from St. Joe, she wanted to focus on cowgirls and the strength and particularly the joy of being a cowgirl. And this is something that comes through in all of her paintings, which invariably include horses, cowgirls, and dogs. And invariably, those cowgirls are wearing red boots. So there's a great deal of joy in her work, and in this case, she's wearing chinks, never to be seen on the Texas range until recently. But the model for this painting is actually, I believe, her good friend Camille Christ, who lives in St. Joe and is very much part of that Real West Symposium, a sweet lady. And Camille poses for a lot of these. It's really quite spectacular. She's one of the most lauded contemporary artists in the state. And of course, Felice House, of course, her large-scale painting in the other room, a repurposing of Western cinema. Part of my duties at the National Cowboy Museum is the Western Performers Collection. We have a pretty robust collection of these theater posters, many of which are actually about the size of this screen. It's kind of hard for us to reconcile that with the way we look at films today. But if we think about the dominance of the Western in film and television from the 1930s through the cancellation of Gunsmoke in 1975, that's 4 decades where nearly everything on the silver screen and on the small screen was a Western. By 1950, there are nearly 50 Westerns on television. They had their own Emmy category. Remember, we only had 3 channels until we got UHF sometimes if you positioned the rabbit ears just right. But think of that. You turn the channel, you were bound to run into a Western. And so what Felice House is doing is repurposing these and changing the dialogue about who appears in these posters. And I will tell you, with the African American figure in this particular painting, it also reminds us of a whole subgenre of black cowboy cinema in the 1920s and 1930s, where all the writers, producers, directors, and actors were all African American. We record that at the National Cowboy Museum. There were, of course, naive artists who experienced cowboys, particularly in East Texas for Johnny Banks, as well as Johnny Swearingen, who decorated his frame with cattle motifs, especially spots. I love that. That's and little carved heads here in the corner, as did Fred Darge in some of his paintings. So naive artists, of course, are taking in and pulled into this very popular culture figure, but there is no greater depictor of cowboy history in Texas than Jose Cisneros. And particularly his northern New Mexico vaquero, and those relate to the very first vaqueros in Mexico moving into southeastern Texas and eventually spreading out to California and all the way up into Canada. The West Texas cowboy image is in the exhibition, but keep in mind that this is all part of a series that Mr. Cisneros did throughout his career as an artist. Now you can't see this, and unfortunately I really wish you could. Jerry Bywaters, who for all intents and purposes was the mouthpiece for Texas painting through the 1930s and 1940s, created something called the Tree of Texas Art, according to him. The important artists who were making art in Texas throughout Texas's history. If I could show you, there's a branch right here that has no connection to the rest of the main trunk of where the real artists were working, and that branch is called the cattle painters. In both versions, because there are two different versions, evidently needed a practice to get it right to somehow marginalize the cowboy and cattle painters. So, this has even taken place today. This, and I wish you could see this quotation. This is taken from a teacher's packet that is still used at the Hall of State to talk about this particular cowboy figure, probably in this mural, probably painted by James Buchanan Buck Wynn. And let's see if I can get close and read it to you. Yeah. Can you see? The arrogant cowboy. Now, if you see the painting, it's really hard to determine whether he is arrogant or not. But this marginalization of the cowboy as figure in Texas art and Texas history is ongoing. So I would posit that Texas cowboys, and especially artists who depict Texas cowboys, are as legitimate as those who paint San Antonio missions, West Texas landscapes, ships in the Gulf of Mexico off Galveston, as well as Texas wildflowers. So I'll just show you a couple of images here. Frank Ray, R.V. Hunter, Fred Darge, and H.D. Bugbee to conclude and to remind you that at the recent 150 years of Texas art exhibition at the Whitty Museum in 2019, believe it or not, there were more than one paintings of Texas cowboys. Thank you. Now, Kathy fussed at me because she said, "You've got 126 slides." I said, "I go real fast." So, do I have time to take questions or no?
Yes. Anybody have questions?
Oh, come on. It is something I feel very strongly about. I don't understand this marginalization, and it's not just Texas art. It's Bill and Linda and I were talking about this. There have been efforts to bury the cowboy nationally for over 150 years. The cowboy is gone. The cowboy is dead. We don't need that anymore. We don't need that symbol anymore. And yet, like Wolverine will, by the way, who will come back, by the way, just pay attention, he's resurrected every time. And the greatest resurrection, of course, right now is Yellowstone. Taylor Sheridan is printing money as much as Fort Worth is. I mean, he can make a mark on a paper, and Hollywood will make a film about that mark on the paper. Not all of them are accurate by any stretch, but nevertheless, that's an important thing to recognize. The Yellowstone phenomenon is a real thing, and the sooner we embrace it, the truer we are to telling the Texas story. Yes, sir?
My question is, all the photos were from Canyon and Amarillo area. Do you recommend our fans go up to the Canyon to see that?
Well, yeah. Panhandle Plains Historical Museum has the most comprehensive early Texas collection of any museum in the state. And by that I mean there are more Texas artists represented there. Many other places have greater depth, but one of the things that, and this was by default because Amarillo Canyon is so far from the rest of Texas, when collectors collected, they either went to New Mexico or they collected in downstate Texas. So what happened was artists from down here were often brought back to Amarillo, and so we felt compelled to build on that precedent and create that collection. We also have the only permanent Texas art gallery in the state, near as I know, in a public institution. And that was something I'm really proud of. And it's the Gaydon family Texas Art Gallery today. So yeah, I recommend it. Plus you get to see Palo Duro Canyon, the Grand Canyon of Texas. How many of y'all ever seen Palo Duro? Oh, you got to get out. Cadillac Ranch is up there. And Panhandle Plains Historical Museum is the largest, I think it's the largest history museum in the state, and at one time was the largest museum, 300,000 square feet, 3 million artifacts. I mean, surely there's something to see up there. It's a great institution. Thanks for asking. And remember what Red Stegall tells us from his programs. You can't see a real cowboy from the blacktop. They're not in the movies and on television and making the news. Not the ones who put meat on the table today. And I say this all the time because I'm a cowboy historian and a Western art historian. This country was built on beef and bread, not on broccoli. Now, I like broccoli. So farmers and cowboys built this country. They did. And those cowboys were all cowboys of color. It's a fact. Just tell the truth. Simple as that. Be honest and paint your heart. That's why these other artists were successful outside Texas, because they stuck true to what they knew. Now, what I mean by that, and I'm a little bit, it's with tongue in cheek, certainly where the Dallas Museum of Art was concerned. But there still is a great bias against Western art in art museums. Only gradually have certain artists made their way into the lexicon of American art, for example. Because you have to remember, I've been an art historian since I worked at Smithsonian American Art Museum in 1985. Most of you weren't alive then, but I was. First of all, American art historians have a great inferiority complex towards Europe. So American art is a little bit on the pale anyway. And then you get west of the Mississippi, and subjects west of the Mississippi, which are Western, oh boy, that's not legit stuff. Except in Europe, you go to Europe, they can't get enough cowboys, for sure. But you get to Texas, now that's a whole nother thing, man. And then you get to West Texas, that's the end of the earth. And I'm saying that firmly with tongue in cheek. So paint what you know and paint what's true in your heart, and people will recognize it. It's the literati, let's call them, the critics and so on. They're the ones that get their noses out of joint. And there's a phrase about a philosopher in your own country. So be a philosopher. Paint what you know. That's what I would say. And it'll get recognized, it will. And this is finally starting to happen. I mean, look, the evidence is in that room right there. We're finally having this. Should it have happened years ago? Absolutely. The last time it really happened was at Fort Worth in 1936. That's a little bit of a span, but we finally got her done. And hopefully that show will travel. I'd love to see it travel. It really should. But where I work, for example, Western art is embraced. Cowboy artists of America are still going strong. They have their annual show in Fort Worth, do really well with their sales and so on. And as I was telling Bill and Linda, Hatco can't make enough hats right now. The demand for cowboy hats is so strong worldwide, they can't make them fast enough. Likewise, Tecovas boots and Tony Lama boots. So everybody loves cowboys. There are those who kind of hide them away for a while, and then they come back out. They do. Now me, I don't own any shoes. I just own cowboy boots and running shoes. That's all I own. So I don't know any better. Someday I'll get a clue, you think? I'm a preacher, obviously. Yes, sir.
How many of these artists would you say were working and able to live on the ranches or hang out with cowboys and outfits versus folks that were kind of just drawing?
Dilettantes? Yeah, that's a really good question, because cowboys in general are tended to be loners, even up into modern times after the turn of the century. There's this great belief that after 1900 all the cowboys disappeared. That's a bunch of nonsense, not true. They tended to be distrustful because when somebody came from the outside, something bad usually happened. So Bugbee, for example, was a Yankee from Massachusetts and always had a very strong Yankee accent. But he worked as a day worker and therefore ultimately made his way in. Cowboys didn't care where you came from as long as you could do the work. They didn't care what color you were, what your culture was. It didn't matter. Yeah, of course there was racism on the range, but that was the exception, not the rule. So the point of your question, I think, is how well were they welcomed, these artists? Cowboys loved Will James, for example. They would hang his drawings in their bunkhouses because they said he got it right. They didn't like to be misrepresented. And they would attend Wild West shows and make fun of the riders. They'd go to early rodeos and make fun of them because they knew that they were bastardizing things they did every day. And so they didn't want to see it in their work. Charlie Russell was greatly embraced by cowboys in Montana, for example. Remington tried to be a cowboy in Kansas and was a very bad one, so he bought a saloon instead. And then went back to New York. But his paintings are outstanding. So it was about trust. There's a currently working photographer named Anouk Masson-Krantz, who's French and Dutch. She married a Kansas rancher and did not know that cowboys still even existed when she married her rancher husband. And he says, go with me and I'll show you. She's now on her, I think, her fourth folio-sized award-winning book in multiple printings of black and white photographs. If you get a chance to ever see her photographs, they're absolutely phenomenal. Now, of course, there are all kinds of cowboy photographers, all kinds of people claiming to be cowboy artists. But Anouk will tell you how long it took her to sit in a cafe over several days for a ranch hand to finally show up, and she had to gain their trust that way. So to just show up with your camera or your brush on a cow camp, they would just ignore you. You would make your way in and they could see you were serious and not going to misrepresent them, then they were usually fairly accepting. Now, there was rough humor, for sure. But it's really a great question. How did you gain their confidence? Fred Darge, for example. Here he is, a guy with a heavy German accent, had served in the German army during World War I, and he comes to Texas and finally becomes a cowhand in West Texas. Of course, cowboys came from all over the world. Danish cowboys, English cowboys, Finnish cowboys, Asian cowboys. Really, they were from everywhere. So.
Does that become like an icon then for America? Like that is the American icon?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So here's your quiz. What do you call a man in a Western hat? What do you call him next? A man in a Western hat. No, a man in a Western hat. A person in a Western hat does not mean they're a cowboy, but everyone wants to co-opt that because that symbol means generally worldwide freedom and liberty, being untethered, not following the rules when in fact they were great rule followers sometimes. I'm sorry? Yeah, go get rid of those Wranglers. That's just good marketing, good for them. So it's a really, and when I visited Hungary in December to see that exhibition that I told you about, they had 40,000 visitors over the run of the show. I got to speak to high schoolers in the morning, part of the American Corner program through the U.S. Embassy, and they were all eaten up with interest in cowboys. And then later on, adult people throughout the day, and I kept getting my picture made because I wore my hat inside there, and I hope you'll forgive me for that. But they couldn't get enough. There are German cowboy clubs, there are Polish cowboy clubs, Japanese cowboy clubs today. They build Old West towns, or what they think Old West towns look like. I'm not making this up. Look it up. You can see. In Spain, in Germany, all across Eastern Europe, and especially in Eastern Europe. It was a great symbol, especially in the former Soviet bloc countries. They had Hungarian Wild West shows modeled after Buffalo Bill came to Budapest. That's a true story because they couldn't get enough. You can't get enough of them today. So it's just in certain elite circles, and this is partly an answer to what you were saying, Only in elite circles. And what it boils down to, in my opinion as a researcher, is fear. Fear of the cowboy because of what he represents. He will not submit. And when I say cowboy, cowboy is a genderless word, ladies. If you talk to a woman in the ranch country in West Texas today, they generally won't call themselves cowgirls. They'll say, I'm a cowboy. That's the truth. Cowboy was an invented showbiz word. Will Rogers is often credited with inventing the word cowgirl. It was actually earlier than that. Boy, I'm preaching, aren't I? My earliest memories are hanging over the corral at my grandpa's farm, looking at the horses, waiting for somebody to wake up to put me on the back of a horse. That's all I ever wanted to be. I didn't think they were in the past. And guess what? They're not. They're not. They're making your hamburgers right now. Right now. And there's a farmer making your bread right now. So give thanks whenever you eat a meal. Remember, there was somebody on horseback or somebody on a tractor that made that for you. So, I'm sorry, I don't even mean to get head up, but I get head up. Shall we continue the discussion or go in the gallery or look at the art or have some refreshments? And I'll stop talking. Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much.